This is lecture 13 in the Western peace tradition. Today I'd like to look at 5 models of war and peace and their implications for us today, and the causes of war, of violence, of conflict, and the implications of it. So one of the most obvious forms, so this would be number 1, the most obvious forms of war in terms of the way it works itself out and the tragic implications of people is a form of what we would call aggressive nationalism. We can see this way of being and thinking playing itself out in the West, across civilizations, China, Japan, Middle East, throughout history, in which a particular ethnic group or ideological group thinks that it has the final answer to bring in the utopian, the good society. It can be a religious political vision, it can be a religious vision, it can be surely a political vision. But this sort of nationalism, and there are various types of nationalism, and I might add many people who think nationalism, then they just think negative without realizing there are also moderate forms of nationalism which are not aggressive in that sense. But certainly in the 20th century, for example, well, we could even backtrack long before the 20th century, but for example, the French Revolution of the late 18th or the 1790s into the 1800s, the early 19th century. This aggressive form of the French people leaving behind religion, which was oppressive, moving forward and creating a new time frame for history itself, and the aggressive nature finally of a Napoleon who sees himself spreading light and justice and peace throughout Europe against the oppressive church and backward societies and the Dark Ages. So this aggressive nationalism, which is so well recounted in Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace, as Napoleon comes into Russia in 1812, and then of course his final defeat in 1815 at Waterloo by the English. But this obviously creates war. If you have a leader or a group of people who feel that they understand the movement forward in history and they are the messiahs bringing in this new world, then inevitably war, and those who uncritically genuflect before them, the carnage that comes from that. We could fast forward the same thing into the Russian Revolution, and of course it spread throughout Eastern Europe. This is the 20th anniversary this year, or the 60th anniversary this year since Boris Pasternak died, and his brilliant work, Dr. Zhivago, that came out in 1958, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Again, it reflects on an idea, people addicted to a cause, and then out of that finally an aggressive form of nationalism, ideological nationalism, in which we are going to spread our ideas. We embody it the best throughout the world, and then the carnage that falls from that. So the French Revolution, you get the Russian Revolution, might just as well mention the American Revolution as well, the clashes that occurred at the Revolution, the American Civil War between the North and the South. Out of that emerging after World War II, the American Empire itself and the multiplicity of CIA operations in Central Latin America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, in which war is very much either overt or not so overt, takes place and lives are lost. So this would be very much first form of war peace, where you have aggressive nationalisms, and these things of course do not end. The second one I was going to mention was the just peace tradition. Is you have many states which are very committed to peace, to order, to law, and good government. But does that necessarily mean they are just? in that sense. And there is always this tension in the peace traditions between those who want peace, order, and good government, but it may not, in that sense, be just. So how does one create just peace? Two figures we can see very, very much with us, one in the early 20th century and one today, and there are many others that could be used. Both are victims of a form of nationalism. One was Gandhi in the 20th century. Britain had dominated India for a couple of centuries. It was seemingly orderly and peaceful, but it wasn't all that just for many East Indians in many ways. And with the whole decolonization after World War II and the violence that erupted, particularly amongst certain English who wanted to maintain colonial control in India, and those who were wanting justice for and decolonization for the Indians, there was two directions you could have gone. One was fight the English through violence. The other was ignore the issue. The third was decolonization, but done in a just and peaceful manner. And Gandhi embodied that particular tradition, trying to challenge the British, but in a just, non-violent, and peaceful manner. The other would be, and of course there was much violence that took place there. The other would be a Dalai Lama, again, a very imperial Chinese government, which we see today in terms of the treatment of the Tibetan Buddhists, Muslims in China, Christians in China, human rights activists in China, Tiananmen Square, 1989. So how is Dalai Lama like, in many ways, others who resisted that totalitarian regime of China, which continues to spread today? What are they to do? Obviously, Dalai Lama, like Gandhi, he can't, in that sense, use violence, trying to preserve and articulate the richness of the Tibetan religion, and so finally forced out of India and trying to form a peaceful and just community in northern India, which embodies the best of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And so just peace is quite different from, say, the English in India, which was peaceful but not just, or Chinese and Tibetans, which was peaceful but not just. How can just peace be embodied in that sense? And so that's always a struggle. Obviously, we know some people, I mentioned earlier Dr. Zhivago, many of the revolutionaries very much opposed the Tsar's peace or order, which was not just. And the revolutionaries then, as we can see many people today also, in the name of justice, can be very aggressive, and it can also spill over into violence. And so the quest for justice can lead to chaos and a lack of peace. And then you get the law and order peace people who subordinate justice for the purpose of peace, and the justice people often subordinate peace for the purpose of justice. And so just peace, how are those held together? The third one then is the tensions between, which I mentioned last week, the Westphalian tradition, which came out of the religious wars of the 17th century, arguing that nation states are sovereign and they have the right to determine both domestic policy and what is just peace within it, but also the relationships to other states. And so there's the sense of the autonomy of states, just as in certain forms of liberalism, the autonomy of the individual. And so that's whole one way of understanding political peace. But what happens when certain states are unjust within? Repression is taking place within those particular states. Do other states have a responsibility to intervene? So obviously some classic ones would be, say, Rwanda in Africa in the 1990s. Many other states, we could play this out in many different ways in terms of the Westphalian tradition is such, on the one hand, states are seen as sovereign, and yet if there are standards above state sovereignty, and this is what the United Nations tries to come along, and this is always the tension between United Nations and, say, the declarations of human rights and the covenants of human rights. Are there standards that transcend Westphalian nation-state authority? And when do states have a responsibility? Are they accountable to intervene in states where violence is taking place or injustice is occurring? And so in the war-peace issue, we live politically in the tension between a Westphalian tradition of state sovereignty, but is that an end in itself? Is that an absolute in itself? And what place and point do things like the United Nations, can they intervene given the fact that they themselves do not have military power unless states within the UN agree to that? And so the war-peace issue is very much a collision between unity, somehow a sort of nation-states working together for a greater good, and we can see the clash in that in Europe between those who want to belong, for example, to the EU and those who do not want to belong to the EU. That's just the Westphalian EU tensions. The greater good for one and all, and the nation-state, the good for my own people. And so when we look at politically the issue at macro scales, because I'm talking about macro scales, next week I'll be looking at the difference between small scale, micro level attempts to mediate, to bring peace, to overcome conflict, and then macro levels in the relationship between grassroots up peacemaking activities and then state or intergovernment means or non-government or government assistant means of doing that, and what's the relationship between top-down peacemaking organizations where there is the bulk of the resources, the finances, the power, and then grassroots up forms of peacemaking as well, which we'll get into later in the course. And so the next one then we'll look at is what are the tensions between the hawk, the owl, and the dove in peacemaking. If one goes the direction of the dove, which is various forms of Gandhian or Tolstoyan or Martin Luther King forms of peacemaking, that presupposes a certain willingness in the state one is in to acknowledge that form of peacemaking. And so Gandhi initially in South Africa, then coming to India, Dalai Lama, China, then India, Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. Well, they are in political systems which allow for that sort of dissent. And so the dove and nonviolent peacemaking is allowed to exist. But what happens if one is in a state, for example, Germany in World War 1930s or 1940s, or say Japanese nationalism, and you differ with that aggressive Japanese spirit which led, sadly so, to the American bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Italy at a particular time, and Russia in the Cold War, French Revolution. In certain conditions, if a person tries to play the dove, they simply disappear. You get death squads or secret police turn up at the door. And so when one plays the dove card, there are certain people who are deeply admired for their work, and they are successful in some ways, but they're also working within a system which allows them to be successful. They should be admired for their work, but if they were in another political system, such as I mentioned, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, certain forms of Japanese nationalism, China at the present time, Saudi Arabia, Iran, people just disappear. And so how does the owl find their way in a world in which absolute pacifism is not acceptable, but you don't want to become an aggressive nationalist hawk on the other hand? And so in grappling with these issues at a larger political level, for quite a few years I was on staff with Amnesty International and worked with a lot of human rights advocates, many of them imprisoned, many disappeared, as a result of their daring to critique the state they lived in, given its lack of a human rights record. Now, some states, people could get away with it, and through Amnesty's work, United Nations work, the pressure from other states, they were managed to release these prisoners of conscience. Others simply disappeared. They were shot, whether Bishop Romero in El Salvador, for example, he's holding up the Eucharist, and in come the death squads and they shoot him down right in the sanctuary. Central America in the 1980s, Brazil with Bishop Romero, or Dom Helder Camara, liberation theology, these people were seen as the problem, and many of the priests were killed. Dom Helder Camara often said, when I feed the poor, I'm called a saint, but when I ask why the poor, I'm called a communist. And so here you have the just doves trying to engage unjust hawks, and if the unjust hawks have immense power in a political system that brooks no opposition, the doves just disappear. And so the dilemma when we think the whole peace tradition, how is it to be made sense of or parsed between a particular, what Heidegger calls a throw-inness or a context, in which some contexts allow for peacemaking and some a person just disappears immediately. And if a person is in a hawkish context, either of the right or the left, the owls and the doves live in a very precarious situation indeed. In a liberal democratic society, one can obviously work that and massage it quite differently. But once a person gets outside of the orbit of a liberal democratic tradition, it's quite different indeed. I was going to, I think that's just war. Yeah, okay, I'll just touch one more. Also the just war pacifist issue also. So when is it legitimate, which we've looked at a little earlier? The dove often, as much and as far as possible, wants to resist the notion of war. But when is it legitimate to go to war, and under what conditions? And not to go to war may be a means of facilitating even greater violence. So the standard ones most of us would be acutely aware of, obviously, in the 20th century or earlier. I mentioned earlier Napoleon, obviously aggressive, Hitler spreading throughout Europe at the time, the implications for the Jews, and many other people, for that matter, who dared to oppose him. When is it necessary for a state to form alliances in a just way to resist another state or coalition of states which are being aggressive and are taking over other states without their consent? And so the just war tradition, when it comes to war and peace, is a very important piece in that puzzle, and grappling with, on the one hand, being wary of the hawk or the eagle on one side and a naive pacifism on the other. And there's enough instances in the history of the West and the East and the Middle East and Africa, Latin America, China, Japan, Taiwan, which bring to the fore that are under certain conditions that war is essential to prevent greater violence. And if there's sheer passivity before an aggressive tyrant, it just increases the injustices. And so how does one resist an aggressive, unjust tyrant and those who genuflect before them? And so those are 5 different ways of approaching at a larger intellectual macro level some of the dilemmas of war and peace. As I mentioned, within a liberal democratic tradition, there is often a greater range of possibilities of how conflict resolution, mediation between people, within families, between communities, politically, can be worked out. But when we step out of the hothouse of that liberal, democratic, affluent heritage, the world is much, much different, and things can be much more ruthless and aggressive and brutal in the way that is dealt with. So in thinking of peace traditions, it's very important to get outside of just a liberal, democratic ethos and understand the bigger historic and global context within which that takes place. And because this class is a class in political science, political philosophy, so I'm thinking of global politics or international relations or international organizations. If a person steps out of that hothouse of the West, even though there are obviously internal clashes, the other thing would be obviously to think about is, given the fact states like the United States, even though internally they allow for dissent, a great deal of CIA operations since World War II have been about destabilizing states through training people, for example, in Fort Benning, Georgia, where a lot of the tortures come out of, and where the aggressive foreign policy enacted in Central Latin America, Africa, Middle East, destabilizing governments, how that takes place. And so this is important to understand. Often, just as within the Roman Empire, those within it were allowed dissent, but the nature of their imperial country often allowed no dissents from those that were colonizing whatsoever. And so beginning to peel back the layers or the rind of some of these issues is very important when engaging the larger issues of war and peace, so that they're either just not reduced to a micro level or reduced to means of peacemaking within a fairly tame and domesticated liberal democratic tradition, without realizing once a person leaves that little island and crosses the water, you enter into a world that does not deal with conflict in the same way, and there are serious consequences for people who dare to question totalitarian or authoritarian governments of the right or left, and often death squads which are hired just to get rid of people who are a problem or a thorn in the flesh to those in power. So when we look at models of peace, very important on the one hand to contextualize models within a political tradition and what's appropriate and is not appropriate given the historic moment and the political context, and what is simply naive to apply in one context which may be quite applicable in another context entirely. So models have to be flexible in terms of how they work, and this is always the clash between the idealist and the realist, and the models which are applicable for the historic moment in the particular states one is working with. Next week we'll look a little bit, this is touched lightly this week, on some of the causes of war and models of trying to make sense of it. Next week we'll look a little bit at negative and positive peace and how these things are understood and how they come about.